You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
If you were tuned into last week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, you remember that at the end of the hour I had to cut off our executive editor, Paul Angel, as he was about to talk about the destruction of Christmas around 600 A.D. There in the area we now refer to as Israel and Palestine, but there in the Middle East, and he was beginning to talk about a very strange alliance between Jews and Muslims, hoping to eradicate the Christians from the area. And of course, we didn't get to that conversation because of time, but I promised you that we would continue it this week, and so that is what we are going to do. And so what Paul is talking about here, he's talking about around 600 AD that the Arabs and the Jews got together, and their goal was to kind of eradicate the Christians from the Holy Land because they felt like the Christians had taken over the Holy Land. And so we're going to pick up the conversation there, and then we're going to finish our conversation on Christmas traditions, where they come from, and how Christmas over the last several generations has become increasingly secularized.
And we had hundreds of monasteries. They destroyed every monastery. Something like we had like 80 monasteries in the Judean wilderness. They didn't like the Holy Sepulchre. They didn't like the Mount of Olives, the Jews. They wanted all this wiped out. So thank goodness. By the way, it was 614 AD when local Palestinian Jews allied with the Babylonian Jews and assisted the Persian in the conquest of the Holy Land, all in an attempt to regain power lost to Christians. Yes, it's an interesting thing. We don't hear too much about that type of a genocide. We're only allowed to hear about the genocide, that one little genocide. There's lots more to say about the subject. I have several pretty good books at the Barnes Review. One is by famed Southern writer. So I think you're going to get the type of point of view that you like, or an honest point of view, right? Written by a Southern historian, not some Northerner, called Christmas Before Christianity by Lachlan Seabrook, Colonel Lachlan Seabrook. Excellent book you can find at www.barnesreview.com. And I have another booklet written by Patrick Chenard. Patrick Chenard is known amongst our readers as very interested in the white history of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And that one is called The Secret History of Christmas, the Development of Yuletide Traditions and the Battle for Our Heritage. He finds the celebration of Christmas with Santa Claus, et cetera, and all the different things that have been retained. The Yule log, for instance, right? The ancient pagans had this ritual, and I believe it was the Teutons, the Scandinavians, and Celts to some degree in Northern Europe, but they would cut down a large evergreen tree, and then that had to burn in the fireplace all night of the solstice, right? And so, of course, we do that today. And so he finds that and the bringing of the holly in, and of course our reverence for oak and for, not being an evergreen, but oak and other plants, just a tie that has kept alive some of our ancient white, but not necessarily Christian traditions. So he has no objection to the almost unwitting incorporation of all these pagan symbolism into Christmas, and he thought it was that our current celebration was a great way to keep these old traditions alive. And to some degree, I have to agree with him. If the ancient church fathers felt that it was necessary to incorporate some of these symbols of nature into the celebration of Christmas, or if it was a particular time of year that they decided it was best to do it symbolically, then that's okay. As long as we all remember that the name of it is Christmas, not Santa Clausmas. Right. And so that's the only thing I have with Santa. But, it is, as you pointed out, it is always disappointing to see people do commercialize everything. They really do. And you can't tell me that it's just for money. I just believe there are people on the sidelines who kind of snicker that when you ask a kid today in the United States what Christmas is about, they're going to say Santa Claus. And then you'll say, really? And then they go, oh, yeah, Jesus was born that day. So it's all part of this. I mean, I can't say I've seen a massive change in my own lifetime in the way we do it. I must say that when I was a child, there wasn't this huge deal about gift giving. Then again, we weren't like overly rich or anything, so we didn't get too much. I was happy with a plastic chess set or a G.I. Joe Jeep, and I still remember those gifts, so that it was very important. But my mother, being a Christian, was always, and a devout one, was always so leery. First of all, she hated putting that a gift was from Santa Claus because she was lying. Okay, that really bothered her. And secondarily, we all had to go to church to make sure we knew where this holiday was really coming from. But it just makes sense, right, that we would secularize and secularize and secularize things to the point where the Cadbury bunny is probably, and chocolate, eggs, and rabbits are more symbolic. Once in a while nowadays you do see Easter chocolate coming in the form of a cross. And I thought, that's the first time I've seen that. And that I can remember, right, when you go to buy your Easter candy, that there was actually Christian symbolism. But it's so dangerous to be a Christian nowadays. Christians are, of course, we do have lots of black and white Christians in this country, so it's not a total racial thing. But, I am interested to see where this goes, what will happen next, and whether or not, is it going to be considered like politically incorrect for Santa to be a white guy?
I've never thought about that, but I guess that was kind of the whole impetus behind Kwanzaa, if you will, there for a while, though I think that holiday's kind of died off.
It has, but they tried. Now, listen, I'm going to tell you something about Kwanzaa. I had no problems with Kwanzaa, although many blacks are some of our most devout Christians in this country nowadays. And I don't know whether their church denominations and their parishioner numbers are dropping like ours. But Kwanzaa, I thought, well, that's interesting. They're trying to give them a tradition. And when you don't have a tradition, it's hard. I mean, do little black kids really want a black Santa Claus? Maybe they do. If that makes them feel more pride or more comfortable in their people and they don't feel, let them have a black Santa Claus for all I care. Okay, but now the black Jesus is a little bit different. A lot of black people like to put the black Jesus up. And if that probably makes them more comfortable too, I really don't care. Because in the end, what we're looking for is good Christians, good Americans, right? And people who aren't going to be drawn into the victimization cult. And so anything Kwanzaa, in my opinion, was at least trying to remind black people they do have a cultural history. Because in this country, until recently, their culture here was only as long as the first slave arrived in Jamestown, I guess it was, right?
Yeah.
And so if you can give them a past, even if it's mythological, we understand how important myth is in our own cultures. Santa Claus and Christmas and all this other stuff being related to it, the more power to them. It's funny, though, Asians don't seem to have a desire, and there's a lot of Korean Christians in the United States. You see the Korean churches all over the place. I don't know what other country has those types of churches. But they don't seem to really push holidays. I don't know what holidays they have in their, what are they, Buddhism and Confucianism and such like that. But I feel like they're very versatile. The Asians are very versatile. They'll just accept whatever's going on because they want to they want to integrate into society as opposed to, say, separate from. So both approaches are fine. But, it's the universality of the upside is the universal love of Santa Claus. And even where you go to a country where there's nothing but non-Christians, they will adopt that idea. And they like him. He's a nice old guy. They like getting the presents, I'm sure. But at any rate, those books I mentioned, The Secret History of Christmas and Christmas Before Christianity, are pretty good, but much better job than I've done here in recounting all the number of tales and customs that were once either pagan or regional and have been incorporated into it. And in a way, when you look at it, I kind of agree with Shinar. Christmas is a big white celebration. How can you not like it? They haven't made him have, like they did in the Netherlands, Santa Claus hadn't got a rainbow beard and a multicolored face, right? We believe that Jesus was an Aryan, right? An Aramaean. I don't know. I could be wrong. But there's some discussion of that, so fine. And so the whole thing is like, to me, it's just when you look at the Christmas, you have got so many of our regional cultural practices incorporated into one thing. It really is just a big celebration of whiteness.
Yeah.
So.
Well, another thing that kind of strikes me about Christmas, of course, any holiday, is the importance of, the music that goes along with it. And of course, at least in the 20th century, and it had pretty much taken place even before my lifetime, but I definitely saw the last little bits of it taking place, during my younger life when I was a child, when I was a teenager, when I was in my 20s. By the time I was 30, I think the traditional hymns of Christmas were completely eradicated from, at least from the public square. We may sing them still in church, but, you watch a Christmas movie or you watch a Christmas show, you're walking around in the shopping mall or whatever and listening to the music that's being played over the PA system. You no longer hear the traditional Christmas carols. You no longer hear the traditional hymns. You hear the Christmas music that was written, back during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Okay, for example, a lot of it was written by Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin was Jewish. You look at the musical credits for a lot of these Christmas songs: Frosty the Snowman, Jingle Bells, White Christmas, all the stuff that we're used to hearing. Why were all of these Jewish songwriters interested in writing songs for a Christian holiday?
That's a good question. And you know what else is, when you look at the shows we used to watch as kids, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, right? And I'm trying to think of some other ones, maybe Frosty the Snowman, but there's almost always a Jewish production as well. You're right, because you go to the shopping mall and you might hear Let It Snow, I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, possibly, but you don't hear Away in the Manger, Coventry Carol. You hear a secularized version, because we're all so scared, I guess. Oh my gosh, they're right. We Christians can't push our holidays and have children have a Christmas holiday. It's got to be for all inclusive. I'm not exactly sure why we've been ever backwards so hard to accommodate everybody else but our own rich history. And you bring up the music, and there really are so many other aspects to Christmas that we haven't even discussed. The things that we buy, the how we decorate, what we eat, of course, turkey. We always have a big turkey, right, at Christmas time, I guess. But I prefer beef. But of course, that's a totally American bird.
The Christmas meal, of course, Dickens, they had a goose.
Right.
And
right.
And I guess most Americans haven't read Dickens, or else they'd be eating goose instead of turkey. But a lot of people had ham at Christmas.
Oh, that sounds good.
And,
now listen, we used to have those geese too. My aunt was a country girl, my aunt and uncle, country girl and boy. And so we had goose, but I hated that goose, man, because it was always shot with buckshot, and you had to be picking the buckshot out of the goose while you were eating it. So give me a nice ham and I'll take it.
Yeah. But ham's not kosher though,
That's right. Well, listen, I always resist the conspiracy angle for just like practical reasons. But in reality, you can't tell me that someone hasn't tried to edge Jesus out of Christmas. And I can't say that our people haven't been willing participants in this whole thing. But yeah, and I get my kid's going to be at a Christmas show. They all sing, and all the kids sing. He's just one of the choir, right? I'm going to be very interested to see what they're going to sing. But I remember when I was a kid, in maybe 1965 to 1970, when I was in elementary school, was the first changing of this. And suddenly it wasn't a Christmas presentation. It was a holiday one. And I remember we had a very large Jewish community in Montgomery County, Maryland, and we were singing dreidel, right? Dreidel, dreidel. And then what was the other one? There's another famous one they have. But we were singing those Jewish songs too, right at the Christmas time. And I look back on it, I'm like, well, that was the vanguard. That was the start of this. And then while there's something to be said for an appreciation of other people's cultures and religions and having some sensitivity towards what it means for them, there seems to be nothing on the reverse for us. And so, I mean, I don't know. it's nice that we all know that this winter holiday the kids get off at school is always around Christmas time. I still call it Christmas holiday. We say Merry Christmas here. We're not living, and I don't live in a Antifa area, right? So we still are very happy, people down here to say Merry Christmas and to have Christmas plays and Christmas this and Christmas marts and all this other stuff without feeling it necessary to think that it's that we're somehow insulting these other religions and by not giving them their own. Whatever. Maybe they should just try to. And by the way, I think that a lot of these cultures, the scary thing. Let me finish that statement. The scary thing is how popular Santa Claus is across religious lines, too. And so you've got little Jewish kids who want Santa Claus to come see them. You got little Muslim kids who want Santa Claus to come see them. And so I found that in Montgomery County, a lot of the Jewish families were almost, atheistic to the point where they just loved the holidays. They would celebrate every holiday there was. They would have Passover and Yom Kippur.
Even Joseph Stalin had a Christmas tree, and Santa Claus would leave a gift under it for his daughter every year.
That's funny. I wonder what Santa Claus was bringing her. Probably a book on the Soviet Union where everybody's picture had been wiped out who had done anything against Stalin. And then Stalin, his wives were Jewish, were they not?
Yes.
A couple of them. So yeah, it's going to be hard to kill Christmas. I don't know how much further they can do it. It's just a slow thing. The scary thing is the news media is so leftist. I was always taught, don't get yourself involved in the left-right, left versus right. It's all a bunch of baloney. But more than ever, I can't find myself slipping into this because the lines have been drawn so drastically between the left and the right. Now, the left at one point in time was relatively reasonable, I feel. It's completely unreasonable now as we see what's going on in Washington, D.C. and everything else. But listen, all I can say is Merry Christmas, because it is still one of the most beloved holidays. And as long as we just can keep reminding people the true story, all the rest of it is gravy, I suppose. Whether or not Santa Claus was originally created or manipulated. I don't think he was originally created as such. I think it just kind of caught on. But when you look at the masters of the media, and you read, say, the book that we have at the Barnes Review, a little booklet by Harvey Reisen called Satan in Hollywood, Anti-Christian Propaganda and Film. I suggest people get that one, too, because there's a lot of hidden stuff, even in our own Christmas movies, which you need to be aware of that is happening. That is anti-Christian, that's just buried in there. And I think I mentioned this last time, the interruption of Christian ceremony. How many movies involve someone busting into the church in the middle of a ceremony and halting the whole thing? A very anti-Christian type of thing, that even in cartoons. And I mentioned once the movie Shrek, in which the dragon smashes through the stained glass window. I'm like, I don't see that happening too much. And then I'm like, wait a second. And Reisen gave us multiple anti-Christian symbols that they're throwing into our film and everything else. So I don't trust Hollywood as far as you can throw them. And I know that given their choice, they would secularize Christmas to it as just a winter break, But anyway, that's enough said on that particular topic. I encourage people also to read the Barnes Review, which has covered such topics as the pagan origins of Santa Claus, the incorporation of pagan symbolism from the very ancient times into modern Christian practice. We've had several articles on this. It's funny, we love to run a good Christmas story at Christmas. I didn't have one this year. And as I looked around, I'm like, we're under assault everywhere. I don't think, our monuments are being torn down. Our religion is being insulted. Our culture heroes are being insulted. Whites in general are being portrayed as evil. It's a funny thing that we had better lock on to what we love and hold it dear, because they'll rip it from you, given any chance.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
But if there was a statue of Santa Claus in a southern state, I just wonder, would people be gathered around demanding that it be ripped down? I mean, our saints are not off limits anymore. That they vandalize cathedrals, churches. We see this all the time, right? When Notre Dame burned, we find out later that this happens, that the lighting churches on fire and cathedrals on fire in Europe by hooligans, and not necessarily always non-Christian immigrants, but many times. And this is a common occurrence. It's happening, and we don't hear about it. So Lord knows what they're hiding from us. But the book Satan in Hollywood, Anti-Christian Propaganda and Film is also available at barnesreview.com.
You know, we talk about different things. You know, possibly, Hollywood. Have they conspired to to destroy Christmas as we know it? Was it a Jewish conspiracy? Was it the government trying to secularize it? All of these different possibilities. But at the end of the day, these schemes can only work if Christian people allow them to. In other words, the schools were able to turn Christmas pageants into winter pageants because the parents simply refused to go to the school board and create the necessary opposition. In this, democratic society that we have, if nothing else, could have just been, making it known that, hey, if you want to get reelected next year, you're not going to do this.
Well, I mean, one of the goals, obviously, of the people instituting any kind of type of new world order or communist system is to eliminate religion, right? I mean, they all want us practicing no religion at all, I think. Well, they want to knock off Christianity first, so they might start working on Islam later. But the question is Christmas so beloved that they will never be able to kill it? And so in some respects, when I look at the popularity of Santa Claus, sorry, Jesus, but when I look at the popularity of Santa Claus, I see something that they might not be able to destroy. Now, they might have taken all the Christmas out of it, the Christian aspects out of most of it. As I said, a lot of this stuff is pagan. They probably don't mind that either. It's very avaricious, right? You want gifts and you get mad, right? The kids get mad sometimes when they don't. They have to be explained that they get anything. That's good enough. But it is so beloved that they may have created a monster they can't put back in a genie. Because I can't even imagine what would happen if there wasn't a Christmas. This is my family's favorite time of the year. We love the cold. We love putting up the trees. We love decorating the house. We love shopping. We love getting together with family members and everything else. And it's just a special, special holiday. With or without Santa Claus, I think it would work. But something about Santa Claus not being Jesus has resonated with people who aren't. Listen, even atheists celebrate Christmas. You know what I mean? Because it's practically made for them now. Yeah. So just cross your fingers that this is one thing. And yes, we did sit by and let a lot of this happen. And this is what I tell people all the time. They say, this person, this group did it, that group did it, this group of plutocrats did it, this religious group did it. Man, if we sat by and let the whole thing happen, then we have to bear some responsibility. But I do not think they can kill Christmas. And there's enough, there needs to be a little bit more Jesus in Christmas nowadays. But besides that, it's, I think, an unkillable holiday. And it is a Christian holiday. And it is a white holiday. So enjoy it while you can.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, You like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
Yep. Well, I do appreciate you chatting with us on this subject today, and hopefully all of our listeners will have a Merry Christmas.
Yes, and I hope you do too, and your family, because you are a stalwart, again, in this battle here for Christians, for Christianity, for white culture, and we all need to keep doing what we can possibly do as long as we can possibly do it. You know that Christianity in general is being portrayed as a racist type of thing, an evil that is a scourge of history that has been much worse for humankind than we say. It's a bunch of baloney. Christianity has been the rock upon which Western culture has been built. I can't even imagine what we would have without it. But it's beautiful holidays like Christmas and Easter that I don't think they're going to be able to crush our love of these things. So don't know what else they got planned for us in the coming year, but certainly we appreciate everybody's support. And hey, if you want to give us a little Christmas present, then you go to barnesreview.org and click on the donate button. We'll take anything with a great appreciation.
Yes, sir. And I know I've been encouraging our listeners here on the show to these last few weeks to go to the Barnes Review website and check out the bookstore because they can do some great Christmas shopping there.
Absolutely.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. We're talking today with Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson, and the topic of our conversation is Orthodox Christmas. Had been talking to Paul Angel earlier in the broadcast about the secularization of Christmas. And so now I'm going to ask Pastor Matthew Raphael Johnson, a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church, about Orthodox Christmas. So Dr. Matt, tell us about Orthodox Christmas.
We're on the old calendar in the Russian Church, the Serbian Church, and there's old calendarist groups within Orthodoxy everywhere that celebrated Christmas Eve on January 6th. What specifically are you looking for? What do you want to know about it?
Then you're saying that the only reason then for the Orthodox Christmas celebration being January 7th is strictly because of the difference between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but that itself has, doctrinal and ideological baggage to it, both within the church, within Orthodoxy itself, as well as during the Renaissance when Pope Gregory had commissioned the group to rewrite the calendar. Yeah, that is the difference, but of course that's a very complicated, very historically loaded different thing. You have to, but the works I've read on the calendar issue are heavily mathematically oriented. A lot of us went into history so we could avoid mathematics. Some of it can be very complicated. So yeah, it's purely a matter of the calendar. But the thing is, there is no purely objective standard to tell which calendar is more accurate. There are many different standards, and there's no reason to pick one over the other. The Julian calendar mixes both the solar for just the fixed dates for feast days and things like that, and then for the Easter, of course, the lunar from the Old Testament. So it's a solely lunar calendar. That makes it even more complicated. I guess the last country to adopt the Gregorian calendar was Great Britain. I want to say it was 1724, and it always was met with violence. People were freaked out by the fact that the state somehow had control over time, and they would lose, 11 or 12, whatever it was at the time when they changed over. It was a pretty radical thing, because this came from the Roman Church. You had a lot of Protestant bodies who refused to go to the Gregorian calendar, but I think now every last one has. I think there were some in Ireland who refused to change over, but I'm almost certain that Britain was the last country to go to the Gregorian calendar, and it freaked everyone out. You go to bed one night, it's October 1st, you wake up the next morning, and it's October 13th.
And so then, and I should know the answer to this question, but I don't, and so I'll let you answer it for me and answer it for our listeners. The countries that are traditionally Orthodox countries, I'm taking it that the government entities in those countries have adopted the Gregorian calendar, and so you have the church on one calendar and the government on another calendar.
Well, not all traditionally Orthodox countries are on the old calendar. When we say old, we mean Julian.
Right.
And that was established officially at the very first synod of Nicaea, first ecumenical synod of Nicaea, I should say. The Bulgarians are on the new calendar. The Poles are. Most of the Greeks are. The Greeks in the Middle East are. And of course, Russia, being a huge proportion of Orthodoxy, is on the old calendar, even when there were attempts to force them in the early Soviet era. Up until 1924, even the Russian state under the monarchy, even under the Kerensky, maintained the Julian calendar for even secular usage. It was Lenin who brought, or right after Lenin's death, that brought the Soviet Union to begin using the Gregorian calendar. And then, of course, they rewrote. They had their own revolutionary. They do the same thing in North Korea. They did it after the French Revolution. They got rid of Sunday, only had a 6-day week. Do something that doesn't last very long. It's confusing. But for all intents and purposes, they went over to the Gregorian calendar, and no matter what they did, the church remained firm with the Julian.
In the countries where the church has adopted the Gregorian calendar, do they still celebrate Christmas on the January date from the Julian calendar, or have they moved their Christmas celebrations to December?
No, those Orthodox churches that have gone to the Gregorian celebrate Christmas on December 25th. Now, of course, what's confusing is December 25th is January 7th. It's just, these aren't, it depends on how you tell time.
Right.
Those actually are the same date. And Orthodox people, I even do this in my letters. You put the date on the top of a letter, and you have to put 2 dates there, 13-day difference. For new calendar Orthodox countries, the 7th of January would be the Epiphany. So they have, the only thing that they refused to change was the mathematical figuring of Pascha or Easter. That's still done on the old lunar system. All Orthodox people celebrate Easter on the same day, which makes it even more confusing. And that wasn't the case in 1923 when a disgraced Masonic patriarch of Constantinople attempted to force this on everybody. He wanted the whole thing. Melitios Metaxas was eventually kicked out of the church and was a high-level Mason. Pictures of him in his apron and everything else. The point of changing the calendar had nothing to do with astronomy or astrology. It had to do with ecumenism. It had to do with joining with the West. There's a lot of British pressure on there to regularize the two calendars to facilitate communication. And there's one world church body and everything else. And that was the purpose of it. There was no question. Had nothing to do with any kind of a physical issue. It was about ecumenical, breaking down jurisdictional boundaries. And that's the reason why I created the Old Calendar movement, of which I'm a part. I've always been a part of it. Millions of people. It's not a small movement whatsoever. For New Calendar Orthodox, January 7th doesn't mean anything.
So then, will you celebrate Christmas on the same day as the rest of us and just call it January 7th instead of December 25th? Or will you actually wait until January 7th of next year to celebrate Christmas 11, 12 days after the rest of us?
When you celebrate Christmas on the 7th of January, we get all the best deals. Everything's on sale. Everything's on sale. By the time we have to return something, the lines are gone. That reason alone should bring people onto the old calendar. One of the unfortunate things is that my father chose to die on that date. You should have picked a better day. It's not really a celebration day for me because we were very close in 2003. But it's still, in our case, most of the liturgical stuff is done on the 6th of January. That's loaded with you're in church most of the day. And of course, prior to that, there's a fast, St. Philip's fast, that starts at the end of November. So you're properly prepared and cleansed by the time the actual feast day comes around. Now, when I was raising children, my kids are adults now, but it helped a lot because we celebrated what we used to call Santa Christmas on the 25th. And that was all the fun stuff. You can't keep kids from doing that. We're not Jehovah's Witnesses. And then the 7th was reserved for liturgy. So the kids never lost the liturgical sense of what Christmas was, because it was 2 different days. And we always refer to Santa Claus as St. Nicholas. Well, there's no question that he existed. So that issue never even came up.
So I was going to ask you that question, and now you've kind of answered it, but I'll let you elaborate on it a little more, how Santa Claus enters into the Orthodox Christmas tradition.
Well, Santa Claus, the way we know it today, comes mostly from Coca-Cola. That's why his outfit is red and everything else. Now, the tradition is older than that. But when we think of Santa Claus, his connection with St. Nicholas is extremely thin. I think in some indirect way it still exists. St. Nicholas is one of the most popular saints in the Orthodox world. Nikolai is still one of the most popular names in the Orthodox world. He's one of these saints that transcend, Anglicans love him, Catholics love him. So his connection with Santa Claus, though, is very, very weak. Of course, the tradition in some vague way comes from one very old story about him, the gift-giving stuff. Again, that has no connection with the saint or the liturgy. The liturgical texts on St. Nicholas don't mention any of that stuff. So that's all a much later development. I don't think it's unhealthy. I think kids should love a guy like that. I have no problem with it at all. But separating the 2 days, avoiding the whole Santa Claus issue by simply saying it's St. Nicholas. So there's no question, Santa doesn't exist, guys. No. He does, but in the sense that we mean it. Raising kids, it actually helped quite a bit. And we avoided a lot of problems. My kids never lost the liturgical sense of the holiday because they knew that there was really Christmas would be December 25th. The Nativity would be the 7th of January. So they always maintained the tradition of the feast day without any of the ridiculousness of modern consumerism, because by the time the 7th comes around, all that's over. So that's actually a pretty powerful reason. Being on the old calendar makes a lot of sense for parents.
So then, do you think that most of the parents in Orthodox churches, most of the families, do you think that they do the same thing that you did?
Often they do, yeah. As the kids get older, they begin to realize the stories about Santa Claus really aren't about St. Nicholas, but there is this vague connection. So that whole issue is I think that's traumatic for a kid, that this very, wonderful father figure is somehow terminated in their minds. The killing of the king ritual has everything to do with Santa isn't real. In a way, for a young kid, that is a traumatic experience. It's like finding out you're adopted. We didn't have that problem. I think there's some Catholics who even do that. When we refer to the 25th date, we would call it Santa Christmas, and it was understood that it was a fun time. We suspended the fast and all that. 2 weeks later, the 6th comes around. The Christmas season, in the consumerist sense, is long gone, and then they could focus on the real story. So I don't know if any other family's doing that off the top of my head. That was just our thing, but I'm sure they do.
Some of the other traditions, if you will, that have fallen into Christmas, the Christmas trees, the Yule logs, the mistletoe, the holly, the wreaths, I could go on and on. Is Orthodoxy averse to those things? Has it embraced those things? I mean, how are the traditions the same or different?
The first Christmas tree in Russia was in 1700 because Peter the Great brought that in from the West. These are traditions that come from, agriculture, natural law. The word pagan is so vague. To the extent that these are just simply from the agricultural season and natural law, I have no problem with them. But decorating a tree as a Russian thing, as an Orthodox thing, it's very, very recent. There's nothing wrong with it. We do it, or we did it. When I had a family, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But it had no religious significance, and it has no tradition in Russia prior to Peter the Great.
Just talking about Christmas trees, I understand Joseph Stalin's daughter had a fascination with Christmas trees and with Santa Claus. And so in spite of his atheism, in spite of his issues that he had with Christmas and other holidays, I understand that even Joseph Stalin, broke down and had a Christmas tree and a gift for his daughter every year.
I remember Shirley MacLaine, when they banned all the Christmas celebrations at the White House, when she was asked about the tree, she said, "Oh, well, that's a non-Christian celebration, so that's okay. They can still use the tree." It has no foundation. I think the very first czar to institutionalize using a Christmas tree was Nicholas I, just before the Crimean War. So it's a very, very recent thing. It's not done in general in Orthodox people, for Orthodox societies, unless they live here. There's nothing particularly special about it, but there's nothing wrong with it. I've never heard that story about Stalin's daughter, especially since she was married to Stalin married a Jew, and she was a Jewish girl. But because those are secular traditions, it makes perfect sense to me. But I guess without religion, all you have is the tree and the log.
So if someone were to go into your home, or the home of a typical Orthodox Christian, during the holiday season, what would they notice that would be different, if anything?
I have a giant Orthodoxy or death flag on my wall as soon as you walk in. So that's it's not a typical bachelor pad. It's not exactly the decor of your typical American. I haven't done a tree in a long time. The trees that we used to have as a family were very small because I was already a priest when the kids were little. We were so involved with the liturgical stuff that became the center of everything. And the tree was fun, but it never, when I was growing up, it was different. I grew up in a secular household, and the tree was a big deal. You always got a real one. But in my house, generally what I'll do here, because I'm here by myself, the cats will destroy anything I put up. I don't put anything up outside because I'm too lazy. Although when I was a kid, my father, even though we lived in a funeral home, we had white lights everywhere. I mean, it was you could see it from space. But for a funeral home, that's kind of an odd thing to do, but we didn't care. When I was a kid, that's what we used to do. And it actually was kind of a big deal. People would comment about it. But I don't do anything like that. With cats, it's impossible. By the way, for people with Christmas trees and cats, a trick you could use is hanging those cats hate citrus. And if you hang citrus car air fresheners from the tree, that'll keep cats from climbing it. I've heard that works. So there's not much of a change. You come into my place, it looks like, because I live as a hermit, it looks like a monastery like any other kind of monastic place, except for some of the political stuff. But I think what I would do is I would probably have a small tree, an icon of the the Nativity, an icon of St. Nicholas, and that would be about it. Again, there's nothing wrong with the tree. There's nothing pagan about it. I don't even know what a pagan is. Those are just traditions that go way back. They didn't have the same meanings as they do now, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. So you wouldn't see much of anything except, pictures of Tsar Nicholas II and everything else. You would in my case, but in a typical American Orthodox household, you will see a tree. Usually we'll see iconography of the Nativity around it, but there's plenty of Orthodox people who don't use it just because that's not the center of everything anymore. The liturgy is so substantial and so lengthy, and it goes on, for many days, and it's a fast. No meat, no dairy. You lower your food intake, no alcohol. It's a time of quiet reflection, not a time of partying. So that's really a huge difference with all of us, and that changes Christmas Eve, of course.
So you said that on Christmas Eve that it's basically a liturgical day, and you spend most of the day in church. What do you do that day?
It's your typical cycle of the all-night vigil of the Vespers. This is a very ancient service that comes from the Old Temple service, starting with the Psalm and the creation of the world, all kinds of lengthy Old Testament reading, especially on the prophecy of the coming of Christ, because that's really the big deal here, that Christ takes human flesh. Now, he took human flesh at the Annunciation, his conception, but his presentation to the world, his epiphany to the world, is essentially when he was born, and people can actually see him. There's always been a confusion in the Christian world about what the epiphany is. In the Western world, pre-Vatican II Western world, the epiphany referred to the visitation of the wise men, and that was essentially worldly men coming in contact with, in-flesh divinity, and they essentially converted as a result of this. They knew something special was going on. Herod knew something special was going on. I've always thought that Herod and the slain innocents was one of the central icons, central figures of this whole thing. People with political power knew that their time was coming up, and they did everything in their power. And Herod killed his own kids. Herod was so paranoid, Then, of course, Matins is very long. There's Gospel in Matins. The prophecies are extremely important. You have the canons, which are liturgical hymns. Overwhelmingly, they come from the Psalms. Then you have readings of the Church Fathers, especially John Chrysostom, after the Gospel's read. And then after a long time, you'll eventually have liturgy itself and communion. Most Orthodox people will take communion, but after a very long period of fasting, and the all-night vigil is an all-night vigil, especially the way the Russians do it. The old believers will be in church for 8 hours on their feet. I can't do that, but that was the old Russian tradition. If you do all this stuff properly and in order, it's very, very long. But that's what's significant. That's what's important, and that's the gift, the only gift that matters.
For most people, Christmas is kind of the end of their year. But yet, if you're on the Orthodox, the old calendar, then Christmas is the beginning of your year. Does that in any way have a different perspective for you? I always love the New Year, the secular New Year, January 1st. I always have a bunch of resolutions. I take it very seriously. It's a way to start over. There's something about it. See, I've always loved wintertime. I hate the heat, and the cold has always been my time. You live in Nebraska, that could be a problem, but I'm always warm. We have several New Years. It really begins at Easter. Pascha is where the cycle begins. Then we have a liturgical New Year, which is September 14th, which used to be the New Year, or September 1st, depending on what calendar you're on, which was the New Year. The January 1st is a relatively recent Western development. Off the top of my head, I don't know how recent, but September 1st was a New Year in most of the Orthodox world. So you have a liturgical New Year. You have the New Year that begins with Pascha. Then you have the secular New Year of January 1st or 14th. So we have at least three. Remember, Orthodox countries, even today, Old Believer calendars, many of our calendars still use the year from the creation of the world, right? Not
from Christ's birth. Peter the Great forced that on the Orthodox Church, which they resisted greatly. I forget what this year is, 78 something. If it's the creation of the world or the creation of mankind, either way. And most of us still, I think only Old Believers use that anymore. But a lot of us still use the much older year. Peter the Great forced that on the Russian world, and that was adopted slowly but surely over time. The New Year from the time of Christ, that was revolutionary.
So, do you think that, and this really wasn't a conversation I was expecting to go to, but do you think that by having a calendar that dates itself from the birth of Christ. And, even now they're trying to change that, from AD to CE, from the year of our Lord to the Common Era. But even then you have to answer the question, well, where did the Common Era begin? And it's like, oh, well, that's what they used to refer to as the birth of Christ. And so do you think that Pope Gregory maybe had forced, and I don't want to say eternal because the Bible says that one day the angel declares time shall be no more, but do you think that he set up an almost eternal testimony to Christ?
But the AD BC thing, I still use that. I will not use any, even with academic journals. I refuse to use anything else. They started forcing that on us. I was in college, so early 90s. They started forcing that on us. Some journals use that. There's a way to look at it where the creation of the world, is a rejection of evolution using that year, but using the birth of Christ as a way to tell time. I understand how that could be a positive thing. I have no particular problem with it. I don't even know what year this is in the old way. It's 7,000 something, and again, that's of ancient usage. But that was used in the West. You have Western Orthodox groups that still use the old year from the creation of mankind, or the creation of the world, rather than the year from Christ's birth. That's not an ancient understanding. So, but I think you're right. I understand why people would use it. I don't think there's anything objectionable about it. It's just relatively new.
So is there a question in regards to Orthodoxy and Christmas is there a question I should have asked you and failed to do so?
Well, it's the center of everything. And we could talk for days, for years on this. God became man, which was a completely revolutionary concept. This is what both Jews and pagans couldn't comprehend at the time. Those two entities don't mix. I'm not talking about, these pagan deities that made themselves into oxes. That's not an incarnation. Those have nothing to do with each other. That's just disguising. No, this is actually an ontological connection between God and man. And it was something that really, the debates with the Jews in Alexandria, for example, it comes up again and again. How is this possible? How can God fit, so to speak, into the form of a man? What really happens is because Christ now has two natures in a human body. That human body, full with his natures and his bodily form, is resurrected. That means that a human being, a glorified human being, but a human being sits as the second person of the Trinity with a human body. Again, glorified, not in our fleshly sense, but he didn't leave a corpse behind. The ascension is very clear. The Bible mentions this in the Acts of the Apostles. So that it's the center of everything. God becoming man is the center, is the purpose of all history. Our lives, everything revolves around the notion that we're not in this cycle of eternal return. Christ took the Buddhist wheel of eternal recurrence and smashed it. That's a horrible way to consider it. It's constant reincarnation, and maybe somehow you'll be able to leave the world and go into this a state of a non-being. That's the only salvation. I mean, that's really what you get when you reject the notion of God's providence in history. It changed everything. It changed how people think. It changed how human beings were seen, because you then partake of this incarnation when you're baptized and chrismated. So it was a bizarre notion at the time. I've always said that if you're going to, start an ancient religion, the last thing you would create is Christ. He did everything wrong according to the wisdom of the world. Everything that the pagans and the Jews were expecting, he completely subverted. He pissed everyone off. And one of the things that he did in that regard, of course, was the whole metaphysical idea of divinity taking the form of a man, meaning that we can be saved. This is the whole foundation of salvation. I don't care how you define it. It's the whole foundation of salvation. It's the purpose of history. It's the purpose of everything. It's a solution to every philosophical problem. There's so many questions there. There's so many issues there that we would never stop talking about it.
Well, one thing that I have preached through the years, of course, is that, you think of Christmas and everybody's looking at the baby in the manger. But the baby in the manger grew up. And it was the man, if you will, and the Savior that the baby grew to become, that without that, the baby in the manger is really irrelevant.
Well, he had two natures, the nature of man, the nature of God. That's been systematized and understood, not only in the Bible, of course, but in the way that the church developed in the ancient world, because this was a big deal. How are those two natures related? Again, that's another thing that radically changed everything. The Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century, the most revolutionary thing that ever occurred. So Christ as a baby human functioned just like any other baby. They did all the same things that babies do. The only thing Christ didn't do was commit a sin. It was still divinity, though. It was always divinity. So in that sense, he was aware of his identity. But you're right to say that the Bible doesn't really mention anything until he's in his 30s. He led a normal life in obedience to his mother and I guess his father for a short time. Was educated at the temple, everything else. Only when he gets to his 33, his early 30s, whatever it is, he then decides to become a public figure. And I think that's very significant. He led a normal life just like everybody else with all the same struggles and all the same issues as God and aware of himself as God without calling any attention to himself, without performing miracles. He sanctified the ordinary life of the common working man, which is what he was.
And with that, I am going to wrap up what is my last broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour for the year 2019. We will have a show next Friday, December 27th. It will be a rebroadcast of our Christmas in Dixie episode that aired last year at Christmas time. And it was a great show. We had some special music by John Schneider and Tom Wopat. We had a Christmas Eve message that I had preached. We also had some other musical performances, Christmas in Dixie by Alabama, Rudolph the Redneck Reindeer, and just some other fun stuff that we did. Grandma got ran over by a reindeer, all that fun stuff. We did it in last year's program. And it was just such a well-produced, well-put-together program that we've had a lot of requests, actually. Are you going to air that again this year? So that's what we're going to do. And it'll also free me up to have a little bit more time to prepare for the move as we're moving our offices and our studio from Florida to Maryland. It's quite an overwhelming move. You ought to see the absolute mess of everything being in boxes right now. Half of things in boxes, half of things out of boxes. It's a sight to see. I really don't want to show it to you. It's messy. But anyways, Christmas is quickly coming upon us. As you're listening to this on December 20th, probably, there is but 3, maybe 4 if you count Christmas Eve, more shopping days until Christmas. And so I would like to encourage you to make the most of them. Go to our Dixie Heritage website, www.dixieheritage.net, and there's some great books, some great DVDs there. Also, www.barnesreview.org. At this stage, I'm not going to promise delivery by Christmas, but you can always print out a copy of the books that you purchase or the DVDs that you purchase, and you can slip them in a nice little card and give them to somebody so that they'll know, hey, this stuff is coming in the mail, and you'll be getting some great reading material, some great DVDs very soon. I do honestly, with all my heart, hope that everybody who is listening to my voice right now is going to have just a great and blessed and wonderful Christmas, and also that you will have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful New Year. And I want to remind you that coming into January of 2020, we'll be splitting the radio show. TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour will become TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. And it's going to be a weekly half-hour program devoted to Southern heritage, Southern history, all Southern, all the time. And we've already recorded the first few shows of the 2020 year. Again, because as we're moving the studio, I might not have access to the equipment. We might not be set up to do shows right away up there in January. So I want to make sure that the broadcast schedule is maintained, that you don't miss a show. So we've already recorded them. We've got some great guests lined up for you. We've got Dissident Mama coming in January. We've got Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy lined up for you on the Dixie Heritage Show. And we're probably going to have Paul Angel and Donnie Kennedy as well. We've got the material recorded. We just need to do some production. And then, of course, we'll have our second show, which will be the Barnes Review Radio Hour. It's the Politically Incorrect History Hour. And we're going to cover all the things that you're accustomed to reading in the Barnes Review magazine during that weekly hour-long broadcast. So we've got a lot of great things coming for you in the year 2020, and I look forward to seeing you again in the new year. But until then, know that we appreciate you. We thank you for being our faithful listeners, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Until then, God bless.